a great pleasure for me. I'm Siri Gloppen. I'm a director of the Central Law and Social Transformation in Bergen, which is part of the Christian Michelsen Institute and part of the university. And we're coordinating a seminar series with the DIPA Center, the Center for Research on Discretion and Paternalism at the University of Bergen, at the Department of Government, where also LawTransform is based. And we have this seminar series on rights, law and democracy, rights, democracy, and welfare, rather. And today we are super excited to have Satang Nabaneh here to speak about the gender politics of autocratization in Africa. And it's not the first time that we have Satang in Bergen, fortunately, because Satang is a very dear affiliate and member and integral part of LawTransform. When the first time she came, she was just starting her PhD on one of the projects that the LawTransform had in collaboration with the University of Pretoria in South Africa, where Satang was. You can come, and then I'll talk about you. Where Satang had studied her master's and was already as a master's student so brilliant that it was very clear who was the give. Actually, there were many applicants, but you were definitely the best. And then Satang in the period wrote a PhD as part of that project, which was later developed into a book that just came. It's actually the first time I've seen it in person or in physical paper, and it's actually a book that you can download in full from Pretoria University Law Press, which is on choice and conscience, lesson from South Africa from global debate, which is on conscientious objection to abortion in South Africa, because South Africa has a very liberal abortion law, but it was, comparatively liberal, the most liberal in Africa for sure, which dates from 94 and the democratic transition, but that has had a lot of limits in its effect to consensus objection. And it says a lot about power and money, and the power of money in this book, but also about gendered politics that you're going to talk about today. And there is another aspect, the other book that Satang has contributed to, that can also be downloaded from Pretoria University Law Press, which is, and it's actually the same artist who have done the covers for both of the books. And this, I think, is particularly beautiful. But it's David Ipko, who's Nigerian, a scholar and artist. And this book is on the politics and legal mobilization around queer rights in a lot of African countries. And there, Satang was writing about the Gambia. And this is where Satang is originally from and started out as a super young activist as a child, and is a scholar and is very central to the Gambia. And just sort of while doing her PhD work between LawTransform sometimes and sometimes the Gambia, and working in Pretoria and living in Seattle, she just did another PhD as well on more on constitution and democracy in Africa. So she's just eminently, and she's also now working at the University of Dayton, Ohio, as manager of programs or director of programs for the Human Rights Center at the University of Dayton, and so she's just eminently placed and knowledgeable to talk about this. So please, Satang.
Thank you very much, Siri. Always good to be home. LawTransform is home. So thank you. I mean, Siri said, I remember back when I started coming 2016, 2017. Now I feel so old. But yeah, and obviously as many that have engaged with LawTransform know, the PhD was really a family project. So I started almost as some of you were talking about my proposal over the years, attended the PhD courses during the Bergen exchanges, but also then eventually finished the thesis and transformed that into the book. And this is just a plug, especially for folks from the Latin American context. I drew a lot in terms of the progressive emergent jurisprudence from the Latin American context, especially as relates to the regulation of conscientious objection. So yeah, so please download open access, a plug as well. Yes, and so thank you again for the honor of having me do the keynote. This is very exciting. And on gendered politics of autocratization in Africa. So just to say that what I wanted to do with the keynote is a potpourri of things, right? So basically in terms of just giving a broad, big picture idea of what is happening, especially around some of the gendered politics and examples and dynamics that we find within the African region to kickstart, obviously, then the panel that follows me as well. So I'll look at someone, especially as it relates to time. I do talk a lot. So if it is time, please just signal as well. I, first of all, wanted to start by stating that I think that I am compelled to, I think, emphasize the critical importance of demonstrating solidarity with the women and the feminist movement in the Gambia, as was highlighted by Siri in the morning. Currently, we are looking at the fate of the law that we have that criminalizes and bans female genital mutilation is hanging on the balance. We do have pro-FGM lawmakers, religious actors, as well as supporters currently pushing for decriminalization of the practice through a private member bill, the first that we've seen in the world. So we're in all major news outlets, not for very good reasons, obviously. And in terms of that, especially, and I think, that development or the current unfolding development is important in the Gambian context, given the fact that the potential reversal of such a law places obviously the Gambia at the center stage for the fight for gender equality. But I think especially given the fact that we're still transitioning from an autocratic rule of 22 years to a democratic one, it also underscores the profound complexities that are inherent within the cultural and religious landscape, but also a stark reminder of how even amidst transitions, religious social movements can also be emboldened, as we have seen, that presents challenges, obviously, in terms of reconciling both religious beliefs, but also with secular beliefs as well. And we've seen this unfolding, particularly as we were engaged in the constitutional replacement project, which sort of stalled, and hopefully we'll get back to that. And so, even though it is a local battle, a local issue, but I think it also resonates deeply with sort of the broader global battles that we're seeing on gender, and which is very relevant in terms of this talk as well. And so I think I wanted to start with, acknowledging that and showing solidarity, obviously, for the folks on the ground doing the work, but also bringing attention to that, both in terms of, I think, especially as we connect it to the times that we find ourselves, where anti-rights movement on democratic norms, but also populist politics have obviously gained considerable traction, but also exacerbating long-standing inequalities, leading to further injury of marginalized communities and regression in human rights protections. I think within the African context, while global democracy indices like VDEM, Freedom House, others have illustrated that Africa's average level of democratization has largely remained unchanged over a long period of time, which has been brilliantly dealt with in the fantastic collected volume by Lees and others, the Democratic Backsliding in Africa book, which was part of the Breaking Bad project as well. But I think acknowledging that whilst things has not changed that much drastically, what we are also witnessing, obviously, within the recent years has been the rise of gendered autocratization, gendered politics in that sense, that really, I think, comes into this idea that autocratic or illiberal leaders in Africa increasingly, as the conversation have been going since morning, increasingly using issues related to gender and sexuality to consolidate power. And so part of this conversation, as I said, is a Kickstarter. In terms of thinking about this from an African perspective, why is it happening? What are the effects? But also what should we be thinking about, especially as we think about pushing back? So just the usual disclaimers right from the start. I do want to acknowledge that obviously one of the challenges of discourse in Africa or writing about it is its immense complexity. And so my intention here is not to essentialize, but basically to give a broad picture, big picture idea. And so borrowing from another fantastic mentor of mine, Charles Ngwena, in terms of deploying the term Africans as a political category to denote Black peoples originating from the continent, but recognizing obviously that they're a social group that collectively share a history marked by slavery, colonialism, and enduring experiences of subjugation and oppression as well. And so this is my sort of introduction. And so part of what I wanted to do in the next 20 minutes or so is one to give a sense of, and which we've already started with, in terms of the rise of transnational campaign, especially around conservative movement within the region, as I said, but also thinking about what are things that we should be thinking about, especially as it relates to gendered politics as well. Obviously, what is happening within the African region is not unique. It is very much connected, as Siri mentioned, a global phenomenon in which issues like sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender equality, but also the rights of sexual minorities have become central to political debates. And we've seen, obviously, powerful transnational campaign advocating for and reversing on these things as well. I know we perhaps have mentioned it, but just thinking around how they organize around the term of gender ideology, especially that was sort of came into being in the 1990s in response to the introduction of the concept of gender in intergovernmental outcome documents during this period as well. But also, scholars have obviously documented that conservative religious actors predicted that the inclusion of gender brought with it a clear challenge to the social order based on the natural family, as has been discussed before, but also a vehicle for the international recognition of abortion, additional attacks on traditional motherhood, and a legitimization of homosexuality. So that sort of serves as the foundational for what we've sort of seen, especially in the past decade, the notion of gender ideology, particularly in the Latin American context, which have gained traction, but also have been used as empty signifier that may mean different meanings, right, or have different reasons as well. And so researchers have sort of characterized the notion as a symbolic glue for those groups who, in addition to resisting sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender, may seek to undermine as well democratic frameworks. And I think that's why it is really relevant, especially within the context of gendered politics, particularly when it is described as ideological within the framework of ideological colonizers and ideological colonization in that sense, especially by the secular West. I wanted to spotlight Awando's reflection, who wrote on religious leadership and the repoliticization of gender and sexuality in Cameroon, where she stated, for example, how anti-homosexuality may function as a proxy for resistance to women's increased reproductive autonomy. And I'll talk a little bit about that example, especially with regard to some of the examples that we've seen, but also have been shared prior as well by Lise and the others during the first keynote as well. I think just in terms of the transnational conservative mobilization on the African continent, obviously, I think whilst it is very central to our mind, there has also been limited scholarship, for example, and research around some of these issues. And so that's why colleagues and I, back in 2020, 2021, actually contributed conceptually, tried to contribute to this sort of literature by mapping mobilization against sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender in multiple case studies, namely specifically looking at the context of South Africa, Kenya, as well as Ghana. Our case selection was based on these three countries. We're really looking at the initial observations of the visibility of the movement, the scope, the ideas, the strategies, as well as primary drawing on, especially in terms of what the potential impact might be on public debate, but also policy making as well. I think in terms of the research, I think part of what we've observed, obviously, is that whilst there is a strong resemblance with findings from research on anti-gender mobilization in Europe or in the Americas, we identified two sort of aspects that stand out in comparison. Firstly, as I mentioned, we talk about the notion of gender ideology as a symbolic glue for the movement. But really what we've seen, especially in those three countries, was that it doesn't really appear as a function per se in terms of it being a central tenet for mobilizing for the conservative movement in these three countries as well. Whilst obviously we saw a little bit of the language, especially around contestation on comprehensive sexuality education within the South African context, we did not see similar pattern in Ghana or Kenya. I think what was interesting, and Siri alluded to it as well, is that given South Africa's very liberal sexual and reproductive rights frameworks, both in the Constitution, the 1996 Constitution, but also in the Choice and Termination of Pregnancy Act, as well as other frameworks, what we've currently also seen is an appeal to the African nationalist political agenda that obviously corresponds with research findings from other parts of the continent, but is also very much contextualized in the sense that it's reflective of South Africa's apartheid past and resistant to the shifting discursive constitution of sexuality in that sense. So thinking about moving from repression and draconian policing to openness and visibility in that sense. I think in terms of also the South African context, especially as it relates to the colonial discourse and references as well, it was, as I mentioned, briefly used in combination with gender ideology framework. And one of the examples that we saw was the Stop CSC petition, obviously developed by Sharon Slatter's FII that we spoke about earlier in the morning, but that we've also seen very much used, especially in different contexts, particularly in Kenya as well. And there specifically, and I quote it here, it talks about how CSC is a harmful Western and UN-driven agenda that seeks to change South African gender and sexual norms under the guise of HIV and teenage pregnancy prevention. It also promotes harmful gender identity ideology, sexual promiscuity, and as well as abortion. And so thinking about that within the South African context, but as I said, it really is not very much reflective in relation to the other African countries that we saw. In terms of just thinking around what are some gendered autocratization dynamics as well. I think part of it is really coming from an understanding that when we talk about gender autocratization, obviously there might be multiple standards and understanding of what this means, but very basically it is really thinking about how leaders use people's social anxieties, particularly around gender and sexuality, to manipulate them. And so we've seen, obviously, increasing literature on the overlapping issues of abortion, sexuality education, sexual orientation, but also other issues as well, which has really been central, as we discussed earlier in the first keynote, to autocratic politicians' rise to and hold on in power as well. I wanted to highlight several key ways that we've seen this manifest in various African countries. Obviously, one of the biggest tenets for this has been the appeal to conservative values, where they position themselves as protectors of tradition and religion as well. So thinking about and what we've discussed earlier about the notion of the natural family, which obviously then they seek to advance today. However, I think it is interesting that our advancement, or even the conservative movement advancement of what is known as the natural family, resonates closely with what we've seen with regard to the British colonial imaginations of family, despite these groups obviously claiming to be decolonial in that sense as well. Such notions, as we know, also do not necessarily reflect both historical but also contemporary family arrangements of on the African continent, as it doesn't really center, for example, the importance of kingship, extended family, polygamous family. And for the record, I do not support polygamy. Female-headed households, as well as gender diverse and same-sex families as well. What we've also seen as well, especially as it relates to dynamics, is that local actors are proactively engaged with and adapt the appeal of the charges of neocolonialism and Western agenda as well. But I think part of the question, in which probably we don't know the answer yet, right, is what make accusations of Western and neocolonial agenda so appealing? We know that obviously previous research has provided both overlapping, but sometimes different interpretations of what it is. Part of the conversation, obviously, for at least half of the day, have been the expansion in the continent of the evangelical Christian churches, obviously, which have sort of centers homosexuality and challenges to patriarchy as the end of the wall, but also in regard to links with nation building that are foregrounded as well. And so what we've seen basically is that African leaders, for example, make claims of authenticity and exercising patriarchal authority by seeking to control bodies in that sense. And obviously, we saw that in the context of the Gambia previously under former President Jammeh, especially around state-sponsored homophobia under the dictatorship regime, which was my contribution to that excellent collected volume as well. And I think in terms of just looking at the literature as well, researchers have obviously stressed that the appropriation of decolonial rhetoric by white foreign anti-SRHR campaigners and their African allies is successful because it also resonates with negative experiences from colonialism in that sense. But I think part of obviously the argument is that it distracts from all the problems, right? So by focusing obviously on these social issues, they divide attention, especially in terms of their own failures in areas like the economy or political corruption, especially in terms of thinking around the masculinist restoration of the traditional gender order, which represents autocratic leaders' ambition to ensure political stability, security, as well as legitimacy as well. And I think the biggest thing that we've seen, obviously, is that it is based on this idea around silencing the opposition, right? So whether they're cracking down on activists who fight for women's rights or LGBT rights, labeling them as threat to national identity. And so that the global conversation obviously is unique in this sense, particularly as highlighted before, as it relates to resistance around LGBT, which is a hot button issue, obviously, for African leaders as well. Quick examples in the Ghanaian context, we saw how lawmakers and activists interpret gender as something fixed, but also that in late 2019, the president of the ultra-conservative North American organization, FII, Sharon Slatter, spoke at a breakfast meeting with the Ghanaian parliamentarians, warning them about CSE as a secret agenda, and how that was also very much reflective in terms of what we've seen coming out of the Ghanaian context. Around the same time as well, the US-based organization, World Congress of Families, that we briefly spoke about as well, organized a conference, an anti-LGBT conference in Ghana with the president in attendance. These two events have obviously given visibility and voice to Ghanaian conservative campaigners and the disinformation that has been shared by them. And recently, obviously, and I know there is as part of the panel that is following, there's somebody from Ghana who can also provide more context, especially in terms of what we are currently seeing recently from February of 2024, the passing of a draconian bill that increases the penalty as well. And so, and also just coming back in terms of the South African context where we've seen, given the sort of broader and more comprehensive understanding of gender, then you also have the anti-SRHR movement also utilizing that sort of language, especially as we've seen with some of the conservative political parties as well. Other examples I wouldn't really go more in depth in, given we know the context is the Ugandan case that Liz also mentioned as well. But I also think, you know, we've also been partly, obviously, been paying attention to the Senegalese context, which has been interesting. But we've also seen, I think, connected to that, that in recent years, particularly in Senegal, there has been a rise in homophobic rhetoric, which has been seen as a way to appease to the conservative Muslim population. But I think if you sort of place that within what we've currently seen with, the political impasse that happened because of the postponement of the presidential election, it could have, we could also argue that that might have also played a part in terms of setting the stage for such a move as well. These are just some few examples. And as I said, I'm sure the panelists that are coming up as well will have more context as it relates to this. We briefly spoke about this, but I also think that part of the what we've seen, especially with the conservative movement, is, as we said, they're strongly, financially strong and well-networked conservative groups. And we've seen, especially in terms of looking at funding as well, that a 2020 report, for example, talks about how the anti-gender movement worldwide received about $3.7 billion, right, which was in comparison to the $1.2 billion that was given to LGBT movements during that same period. And so I think just in terms of that idea, I think what we've also seen especially is this framework of, or at least a theory of the modular homophobia, which is in terms of how they sort of recycled homophobic scripts that are drawn upon across national context, but also used by political leaders, but also other actors as well. But I think part of what we should be thinking about is how do we complicate the discourses, especially as we think about the exportation of U.S. culture wars to the African region. I'm looking at you in terms of timing, so just flag when I have a... Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so and I think just in terms of thinking about modular homophobic discourses as well, we've seen especially as it relates to the Maputo Protocol and how there has been a conversation around utilizing this, and we've seen Sylvia Tamale as well as with other researchers reflect that acceptance of sexual and gender diversity will ultimately underpin patriarchy and the control over women's bodies as well. In terms of effects, I think, we could spend the whole day talking about the effects of gendered politics, of autocratization on the different marginalized groups, whether those are women, but also the LGBT communities as well. And particularly, I think, within the Ugandan context, where obviously a fellow transformer of ours, Adrian Juko, also notes how Uganda's very repressive legal regimes and politicized social political context continues to impact the communities as well as other scholarship around these issues as well. But obviously, democracy suffers when leaders exploit social divisions. What we see, obviously, is weakened democratic institutions and human rights protections as well. I wanted to flag two things in terms of what I have been thinking lately, especially as we think around countering gendered politics in that sense, especially of autocratization. Obviously, I think one of the elements that we should be thinking about, and which I think we're starting to really see on the continent, is around intersectional organizing, in which movements are not really just thinking about their own issues, but are really working closely together and centering the whole idea around intersectional approach in terms of organizing across issues, across communities, across country context as well. But I also think as we think about research, given that we do have PhD researchers as well as master's students here as well, is thinking about even within our research, how we stand in solidarity with impacted communities rather than just doing research on, right? So thinking about how do we build relations based on trust and mutual understanding, but also in terms of incorporating the communities, the impacted communities' perspective, especially not just as it relates to, the final product, but even as we think about the research design and making the research processes and outcomes more transparent, more open to critique, especially by the impacted communities and those it relates to. And so thinking more in terms of how do we deploy research that strive for research for and through action rather than research on as well. And I'll spend a minute or two to conclude. I know that was like a brush thing, big picture ideas. But just in terms of thinking around gender politics as a serious threat to democracy and human rights, perhaps I'll go back to Livia and say there's hope. I'm not sure I'm as optimistic as she is, but I think there's hope given that, movements are really trying to pay attention to what's happening, but we're also preempting what the conservative movement thinks around some of these issues as well. So thinking about how do we guarantee that when we're tackling issues affecting the lives and ambitions of Africans across all sectors, the focus remains squarely on the humanity of Africans. And this brings me to Frantz Fanon's seminal work on the wretched of the art, in which he highlights the shortcomings of African nationalism, especially in the aftermath of colonial rule. And I think the takeaway from all of this is that, regrettably, marginalized groups such as women, but also sexual and gender minorities, are often overlooked in the post-colonial discourse, particularly by the African states, despite their aspirations have fallen short of ensuring inclusive citizenship, particularly in regions where dominant cultural narratives have marginalized certain communities, particularly as we think around the domain of sexual and reproductive health, but also the governance following African independence have unfortunately perpetuated the same forms of oppression prevalent during the colonial era. And that brings me to the end of my keynote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Satang. I forgot to say in the introduction that Africa Today named Satang as one of the 10 scholars to watch on the continent this year. So we're very, very honored. So I wanted you all to know that. So, but now we have a great panel. So could the panelists please take their seats? Because as also forgot to mention, this is not only part of our RDV seminar series, it's also part of a PhD course that we started, or a PhD conference rather, that we started this morning. And we're very fortunate to have 4 of the participants to the conference from across the Global South, at least across Latin America and Africa, to comment on Satang's keynote. And then we'll open up to questions and comments from you who are here, and also if anyone on the following us online has any comments. And then I'm relying on Susanne to let us know about that. But so I would like you to each start by presenting yourself. So Michelle can start, and then just say who you are, all of you first, and then give your comments.
Okay, great. My name is Michelle Hafeman. I'm a PhD candidate in political science from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Very glad to be here. Thanks.
My name is Nahaja Adam. I'm a Ghanaian, and I'm currently studying at the University of Pretoria doing my LOD. Yeah.
My name is Kula Chitsike. I am a PhD student at Rhodes University in South Africa, but I'm based in Zimbabwe.
My name is Helena. I'm from Brazil. I'm a PhD candidate at Fundação Getúlio Vargas, and I'm very glad to be here as well.
So thank you all. And I think I will just start with your comments.
How much time do we have? 5 minutes. Okay, perfect. So if anyone also give me a sign when
there is a clock.
Perfect.
So you
that's
all the old school.
It's an old school.
Well, congrats on the presentation. To be honest, I'm very ignorant about the African case, right? All the African cases, but as Siri said, yeah, we have a perspective of a global South, right? I will talk about my project later, but there's a work about from Rosana Piñeiro and Tatiana Vargas Maya that says we have to study gender and autocratization from a global South perspective, because we have a special context that Barbara has a big variation from the European context, and also the North American one, right? I want to comment on something you said at the beginning, right? How you took the Latin American case, right? And the conscious objection politics in the continent to how do you say, to address your work, right? And I will start making a little bit of an introduction talking about the Chilean case, right? As probably you know, Chile adopted an abortion law in 2017. The law was entered to Congress in 2015, and immediately as it entered by President Michelle Bachelet, you heard my story before, so I won't repeat it. But immediately as it started the work in the legislative work, right? The right and the conservative groups of the parliament objected the law and pushed and pressured until they got to include a conscious objection article, right? What does it mean? Like in every country that has this kind of regulation, it means that everyone, every physician or doctor that has the capacity to perform an abortion can declare that he's an objector of conscience because of religious reasons or faith, whatever, right? That means that actually in Chile, we have 52% of the physicians that can perform an abortion that are conscious objectors, right? To paint the picture for you, there are regions in the country that only have public hospitals. We have a strong private sector hospital, like a good neoliberal economy, and a not that strong public health system, right? There are regions in the country, the more extremes in the north and in the south, where you have hospitals where the only physician that can perform an abortion is an unconscious objector, yeah? So what is particular about this case, and maybe it makes sense to you, right? That this was part of one of the strategies that was carried by the conservative groups, not far-right groups that are my object of interest, because there was an informal coalition between the right and the Christian Democrats, right? This is very studied by Mala Hatun in her book, so I won't get into that any further, but it was not only the right, it was a broader conservative coalition, right? And what is particular too is that the number of conscious objectors has been growing since the 2017 and now. Just before I came here, we have a transparency system in Chile. You can ask for the information of the public services, and they can take 20 days to tell you we don't have it, or we will answer in another 20 days. So I requested the numbers for the conscious objectors because it is growing increasingly. So I would like to ask you, since you studied our context and this case, do you see here a kind of a illiberal script when we talk about gendered autocratization or anti-gender politics? We repeatedly hear that illiberal parties or illiberal governments have like a template, like a script, right? What we see in the case of the conscious objection in Chile, I'm pretty sure we have heard in other countries in Latin America, and as I learned now from your work in Africa, right? And how this script is impacted or influenced by the post-colonial context, right? Because in Latin America also, I will talk of the case of Chile particularly, we have still like a oligarchic constituency, right? There's a work of Get-Done Off. I'm mispronouncing her name very badly, but I believe that she's a European researcher that says that there is like a traditional constituency, a conservative constituency, that is static in an electoral system, right? But in the particular case of Latin America, it's an oligarchic constituency, right? That links to conservative groups. How do you relate with this from the African experience? Is there like a niche or a static group from electors, right, or from political actors that won't move from this oligarchic vision of the world, of point of view? And to finish, right, what knowledge would you share for us in the continent, right, to address the growing of the far-right parties and the instrumentalization of this regulation, like the conscious objection, since we would assume that as far-right parties advance or they grow, for example, in Chile, the conscience objectors will grow as well, right? That's it.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Very
Mhm.
good.
Okay, let me tell myself, I don't want to be that person. So I thank you for such an amazing presentation. As Carolina said, what do you even say after you said something like this? But I made 3 points to more like speak more from the Ghanaian context. So you mentioned specifically the fact that they use the concept of family and how neo-colonial it is. And that is exactly what the case is, because you mentioned specifically in the West African context, when you talk about the concept of an extended family, it's something that I've always thought of as, how do we have an extended family? Because there's no equivalent of the word extended family in any local Ghanaian language. It's just family. So some of these things are some of the things you need to think to when you think about how the anti-gender movements and anti-rights movements push for the idea of the traditional family. What does that look like for us? And hence, as I would say in my presentation, we need to look at decolonizing the concept of a family from indigenous points of view, especially in Ghana, using Ruhu, I love him, in terms of his idea of decolonization, that is divesting ourselves from all forms of foreign intrusions in our conceptions of things. So that would look like, as you rightfully said, use emphasizing kinship and other things, which we find missing in all these, in our case, legislated issues of family values. Yeah. And I also made a point about the issue of the CSE in Ghana and how it's linked CSE, yes, and how it's comprehensive sex education, sorry, which is linked to how the anti-rights movement was moving. In Ghana specifically, what had happened was they brought up this comprehensive sex education conversation just as they were introducing the anti-LGBT bill to say, exactly, this is what you are going to teach your children. So it was dead on arrival. There was no way it was ever going to make it. So that's another strategy that they used, which I found very interesting. And I always find this very interesting when people just buy it like that. I'm just like, they are saying we want to teach your children how not to get raped and how not to be sexually assaulted, because in Ghana, there was a research that was done, I think it was last year, and it's the number of teenage pregnancies, and this is just pregnancy. It doesn't talk about people who are sexually abused or people who have sex without consent, but about 52% of girls. Yes, teenage pregnancy. And this is people who actually get pregnant. So now the question is, why are we opposing CSE when there's such a dire issue and a dire need for us to have this in our curriculums for everybody to benefit from it? So yeah, that's also very interesting to note. And then the last thing I have was how the anti-LGBT bill can be used as a stepping stone to counter abortions from the viewpoints of family. So for us, there's a specific portion of the bill that says, these are Ghanaian family values, and if you subvert it, you are going to jail. So crazy stuff. So the question now is, and what you were saying just triggered my mind, like my thinking about it. So then if we say that gender is binary within the Ghanaian concept, family and this is a stepping stone, is sanctimonious, no one should touch it, whatever. What is to stop you from saying, if someone can bring such as some assaulting argument as abortion is torture, which I'm still trying to wrap my head around, what prevents you from saying that abortions threaten the family? So I'm also thinking about how this bill, we see it as it's just for the gays, the homosexuals are going to jail. However, it has ripple effects on CSE and how girls have been affected by this. And it also has, aside destroying what we minorities and looking at Ghana as an ethnically homogeneous state, which is not, it also has some ripple effects on abortions, which now that it's as the bill is as much as law, then it makes it easier for them to now target abortions. So yeah, those are the three things I have to say. Yes, thank you.
Very interesting. I just want to add that this morning, André, she was saying that these two tropes that she finds in Eastern Europe, but globally, that are protector culture, protector children, is also what you very much is reflected.
Basically, the textbook, they didn't change anything.
No,
Like the
so
same
that is
thing.
very interesting.
Textbook.
But what is
How it
interesting
is in Europe.
in that is also that this perspective that protector children doesn't, to protect them from rape is not part of it. So it's a very selective way of thinking around protected children, but it was very useful. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Satang, for your presentation. For me, what stood out was the statement that you said, I think almost at the beginning, about democracy backsliding in Africa, raising the question that what does democracy really mean to us in Africa? And is it something that we need to get back and really look into? And do we need to redefine democracy for Africa? But then again, looking at the way Africa is so different, is it something that's possible? But we are really struggling with what democracy means for us as Africans. And the other point that I wanted to raise around that was the issue of trying to bring in women into decision-making processes by using gender quotas. And for me, gender quotas have been, looking at it from a Zimbabwean perspective, brought in to just raise the numbers of women, but not giving them any power. So there's that issue that, okay, we have all these women that have been brought in, and some of them are actually being used to accept the crumbs that we are being given to keep patriarchy going. That's the way that I see it in our context. We have the quotas in our constitution. It was supposed to be for 10 years. It's been extended for another 10 years. Yet we are saying we should be looking at 50-50 representation. So if we keep extending, we'll never get to the 50-50. So what exactly are we saying? Then the other issue that I would also like to talk about was what you mentioned about colonialization. What made it so appealing? What was it? Because as African societies, certain African societies, at least the ones that I've been studying as I'm doing my own PhD research, looking at Zimbabwe, I've looked at Nigeria, where women actually had power in certain decision-making processes, whether at family level and at community level. But that all started diminishing with colonialization. So what is it in that got us there? And then issues around LGBTI. For us in our constitution, it was never there. Zimbabwe has always said this is not something that we are interested in. It's we are a Christian society, and this is not what we are about. And we find that even with our opposition, that's, as I mentioned earlier as well, that they're coming in saying we are a democratic alternative. They are themselves very hesitant to take on LGBT rights because of the fact that they want to be voted in, being aware that Zimbabwe is a very Christian society, and the general sentiments of the public around LGBTI, right? It's not, as I said, it's not in the constitution, it's not accepted, but there seems to be let them do what they do, but we're just not going to yeah, we're not going to accept it, but we are also at the same time just letting them be who they are. So those are the few things that I picked from your presentation. The issues around the LGBT communities, which is very complex and very topical in Africa currently.
Very interesting. I just also wanted to say one comment to your last comment, because sort of studying the longer trajectory of politicized homophobia in Africa, of course, this was pioneered in Zimbabwe by Mugabe in the 90s. So, which is in a way interesting, because what we are seeing now is that it's not a political issue. So that is interesting to see whether that is sort of a trajectory or whether it's a phase. That it's interesting, because now it's much more politicized in other parts of the continent. And maybe it has to do with attitudinal changes in the southern part of the continent, but it's something that is interesting to follow. So thank you for bringing that up. And then we go to Brazil.
Yes. Okay. So Satang, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very inspiring. And I will draw on your diagnosis that the gender ideology was a glue, but it was not like the main claim. And also take from your discussion on democracy and from my background in political science, because on one hand we have like democracies, they're attacking minorities, and we see that it's not enough that we have only elections. On the other hand, there is also like the reality in some countries in Africa that electoral authoritarian states use the gender policies to maintain power and to legitimate. So we see we need regular elections, but regular elections are not enough. And we do have a colonial or imported concept of democracy, a very narrow concept that sometimes we are just creating international indexes and measuring democracy. That's not enough, because some countries are rated as democracies, but there are some things that we are missing. And so actually it's a hard question that you first made, but from your experience and from your research, what do you think that an interest that this concept that we need to build should safeguard in terms of interest, in terms of public sphere? Because as you mentioned, like there is this authoritarian script that can change for every nation's ghost. And in the end, like we need to try to do like the opposite, which is to safeguard what we want to be. And it's always going to be different forms of family. And we are always trying to define ourselves by how we are being attacked. But we should have like a public space that we can just be it, independent of it. And I don't know, I don't have actually, since you're a great scholar, maybe I asked the question. No, but what do you think in terms, like we talk about public sphere? I know if public sphere is the right interest, or I know some guests you could comment on what democracy. I know it's too general, may not work, but it may translate something. I don't know, it's hard, especially from Brazil. I guess Lívia mentioned before, we have like a lot of institutions that safeguarded us from Bolsonaro, but we are still having a hard time in terms of a lot of speeches, public speeches that were not addressed, and people were not made responsible for it. And we don't have legal claims for it. Sometimes it's really complicated to translate it in law, in rights. So yes, I guess it's an open challenge. Yeah.
Super important. Thank you. Wow. So I'm a little bit nervous now, but I'm actually going to let you respond.
Okay.
For a few minutes, because you had so many really, really great comments and questions. And then I will open up for those who want to give comments and questions. But I think it's fair to those who really gave in-depth, insightful questions to get to a quick response.
Okay.
And then, yes. And then also when I open up, you can also ask questions to each other once I open up.
Sure.
No, but I'm just so that you know. But yes.
Okay, so first of all, to say thank you very much for the compliment, but I think more importantly for listening and engaging with my potpourri. I know I was all over the place, touching on and giving the big picture idea, but I also like the fact that you were also able to zero in on your own context, very much reflective, obviously, as we said, as it relates to the global south. So I'll just answer things briefly. I might not touch on everything, but I think just going back to your question on conscientious objection, even though I chose not to engage that much as it relates to that, as again, as Siri said, it's open access. There's a podcast as well. You can download and listen if you don't want to read as well. But I think in terms of, your question around how conscientious objection is being instrumentalized in that sense as well, I think it's particularly interesting that given when we talk about the transnational movement of ideas and strategies and tactics, right? Obviously, conscientious objection within the African context is different. And that's why I majorly also focused on drawing from the Latin American context. Part of it is because, especially when you look at the abortion regime within the African context, it's varied in terms of majority of African women or individuals who can get pregnant actually live in restrictive abortion regimes, right? And so that serves as a starting point to say that Africa's perspective, especially as it relates to the issue, is limited in that sense. And so that's really also the story of the book, right? There's a story about Africa's potential contribution, especially looking at law in action within the South African context, and thinking about the exercise of conscientious objection, not just about freedom of conscience, not just about balancing of rights, but how obviously it is a tool within the conservative movement's toolbox, right? In relation to creating discretionary spaces where, especially if there's a lack of regulation, then things happen, right? And that's what we've seen with the South African context. But I also think part of what we've also seen as well, which is very interesting, right? As I said, especially in terms of the importation from the US context, is around legal strategies. And we've seen that very much, especially in the South African context, but also Kenya, as well as other African countries that are more into strategic litigation and engaging around legal mobilization in that sense. So a quick example would be the South African recent case about fetal burial, where the legal arguments were drawn from a Supreme Court case in the US, Box versus Parenthood, where they were looking at the Indiana abortion law as it relates to a individual's right for fetal burial, right? And so it was sort of the legal arguments were sort of transported within the South African context in that sense. But also, I think what makes, and I'll stop on conscientious objection soon, what makes conscientious objection, I think, interesting within the African region as well, despite the fact that majority of, as I said, of women and others individuals who can get pregnant live in restrictive regimes, Africa is also unique that we've increasingly seen the trend of expansion of abortion grounds, and increasingly in terms of liberalization of the abortion regime, right? And so obviously then that brings up the issue and makes the issue of conscientious objection important, because it is going to be an issue within the continent as countries continually expand on those issues. And now I'll stop on conscientious objection because I could spend the whole day talking about it.
Yes, I'm just going to say one small thing on that, because it's a general issue.
Yeah.
I think it's also extremely important because it looks at the implementation.
Yeah.
You were talking about exploiting discretionary spaces, but I think in general, one strategy that you're seeing is that it's, besides attacking the rights at the formal level, it attacks the way in which rights are being implemented or not. And that can be done at the policy level, and liberal actors have been quite good at the policy level, and then it's at the individual level. So it's rights language, it's at the individual level, and it's sort of working with hearts and minds. So it's just very interesting.
Sure. And then I'll just take a minute to reflect. I think, especially, I think there was something raised about issues that are connected, and I think I mentioned it, but what we've obviously seen is that the variety of sexual and reproductive health and rights issues, whether abortion, CSE, issues of same sex, as well as others, are used in very uniform ways and consolidated ways in the region. And that's why, it becomes more important for the pro-rights movement, obviously, then to engage and in a very consolidated and connected way as it relates to that, but also shifting away from where we're always reactive, right? And I think that has really been the challenge, especially within the African region. And I will say even, from the Latin American context as well, even though, I mean, I give it to you guys that you're very, as was highlighted as well, I think the part about communication and how the movement with regard to branding and communicating, especially its stance and ask, I think is brilliant. African countries can learn from that, but I also think, given obviously the US context with the Dove station, as well as everything that we've seen, obviously can draw quite a bit on that as well. And just lastly, I think, on the idea of the textbook and copying and pasting, right? As I was mentioning, I think what is interesting is that in countries like Kenya, in countries like Ghana, right, it is the exact thing that is copy and pasted, right? Right. But where, for example, there is more of an expansive view of gender and also a shift, obviously, towards democratic ideas and understanding, as the South African context shows, then there is a more strategic language in terms of not just copying and pasting, but that's how we also see the usage of gender ideology within the South African context. So looking at where African countries are as it relates to their own understanding of gender also informs how they even approach some of these issues, especially in terms of terminology, but also what is the organizing glue for the movement as well. And I'm gonna stop.
Thank you. This is excellent. I'm constantly abusing my privilege as the chair, so I'm also going to make more and more comments before I open up, but please show your hands. And then I want to just say that one set of actors that we haven't been talking about, but are much more significant in the African context than in Latin America or Europe or the US or international aid agencies. And the international aid agencies working on sexual and reproductive rights. So that is a type of actor who then enters the playing field in ways that it's not, I don't think that the combination is thoroughly theorized, the way in which it plays into the scenes. Andrea, you go first.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation and every comment that was added afterwards. I was kind of like, my question just popped up because like after the questions, you mentioned what Michelle said and said, thank you for your insight about the situation in Chile. It's very like also representative of like the global South. And then that makes me think like she was talking about Chile and she was kind of saying a lot of things that apply exactly to my country. Like really healthcare is going who knows where, and and the illiberal toolbox and this course is basically applied in the same exact way in my region and in the two regions like on the north and on the south. You cannot get an abortion because conscientious objection is so prominent, and we're talking about like how religion is highlighted in when these questions are being like evaluated. And I mean the Vatican is our garden, so do you all think, actually this question is for everyone that might want to answer, could you elaborate a little bit more on that, how this like categories global north and global south actually shape the debate about these issues? We're so ready to say, oh yeah, they're trying to implement some democratic advancements, but then they are not, we do this distinction between like formal and substantial rights, and we're so ready to do that with global South countries, and we don't realize that sometimes we need to look at our own countries. So I'm thinking that maybe there are more effects of this categorization that I might not thinking about, and maybe you would add about.
That's a super relevant question, Andrea, and we'll collect a few more. I just wanted I was thinking about Italy, because what we see in some countries, including Italy, is that there is also conscientious objection for institutions. So hospitals can object. So they have a conscience, and they can object. And in some countries, that's prohibited by law. So that's also interesting. Yes, and then it's Sasha or
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering, you mentioned modular homophobia, and I kind of get what you mean by that, but I just wanted to ask if you could maybe elaborate kind of what are the modules there, what are kind of the elements that are usually, I guess like imported from country to country. Yeah, if you might have touched on that, but I just wanted to maybe ask if you could elaborate.
Thank you so much. The keynote was brilliant, and the panelists right now are really bringing like points. I have this whole notes of questions, but I'll choose some, and I'll bring about just a tiny comment about the objection, a conscious objection in Portugal. You bring about the institutional objection, which is really important because we had last year a report in Portugal counting that we only have, at least in the law, the objection for the doctors, like individually, but most of the hospitals don't do abortion because hospitals have this practice that is not written, but the institutions that they are consciously objections to the abortion. And we also have this part of public and private hospitals, because we have doctors objecting to do abortion in the public hospitals, but the same doctors doing it in the private hospitals. So this is really interesting, bringing about this type of discussion. This is just a tiny, but I have two questions I would really like to make. One of them is about representations of women in politics in Africa. I think that before the 90s wave of democratization, we have, of course, thanks to Patrice Lumumba and Amilcar Cabral, which is close to me than the other, but this more representations of women in politics than, for example, when multi-party systems was introduced in some of these countries. And I bring this context to ask if this can explain why now the autocratization, the new wave of autocratization in some African countries, why we're having this women's representation being brought in the debates again, not only about quotas. And my second question is about, we also talk a little bit about absence of penalties, for example, for not only for abortion, but also for LGBT, or being more like in the informal level. So a little bit outside. Some African countries doesn't have any penalties like it's practiced like for abortion. And I was thinking that instead of this is just an idea, and I want to hear about your insights. Instead of waiting for the conservatives to politicize abortion and LGBT that are not in some of the countries they are not politicized yet. Should these countries or the feminist organization in these countries really politicize, for example, abortions to put it more in the public sphere, start taking it from the private and traditional and put it more in the institutional public sphere, instead of waiting for this to be from not being really regulated to being criminalized? That's just my questions. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll allow one more question.
Really short one. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on the post-colonial narrative, because right now one of the coworkers is researching the post-colonial narratives within the Polish landscape, and she has also found like this kind of narrative that pro-abortion rights activists are trying to impulse these Western values in Poland, right? Trying to kind of erase more like Slavic roots of the culture. And in that way, those representatives are bringing and keeping, and kind of protecting the culture of the country. So I'm seeing some resonances there, but I want you to ask if you could expand more a little bit on that. And also if there are some resistance regarding that, if it's that contested issue, because also some feminist movements are saying like, no, actually you are imposing vision of family, really patriarchal, that is not like the Polish family, because Polish family is also diverse and inclusive, right? So if some movements are contesting this narrative about the original family, maybe within African countries, and if have you found maybe some kind of other narratives, because also Marta was sharing this with us, like there are some in rural populations in Poland, they were also saying like they want to erase Polish people from Poland. That's why they want to impose abortion, because they want to control natalism through it, right? So these environmental people want to stop us to reproducing us by using those methods, right? So there are also some connections in the discourses being anti-environmentalists, right? But also connected with, as you were exposing, homophobia. So there are many connections there. So I want to ask you, have you found other narratives that are connected? And yeah, great presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And Jan, Satang, you have exactly 3 minutes to answer all of it.
Do I go last or do you?
No, you are actually the only one to go.
Oh,
I'm sorry. That's all we have. And then we can discuss more in the back. But that is actually how it is.
okay. So I need to choose what I will. Well, I appreciate all the comments. Obviously, I'm here and happy to engage further as well. I think obviously what's interesting, especially on the idea around conscientious objection, we know that, over at least 70 countries now, engagement, even if we do not know it in terms of the more formal sense. I think I have mentioned Italy in the book, if I'm not mistaken, in that sense. But I think what, and I'm so glad of the many questions around conscientious objection, because I think there is, well, 2 things. I think one is there is need to have a global South conversation about conscientious objection, right? Especially
Italy is part of the
Exactly. There you go. As well. But obviously also seeing the recent developments, especially within the European human rights system and some of the jurisprudence coming out of that as well. I think there is also a broader global conversation around conscientious objection, especially as Siri was mentioning, as it relates to not just in terms of how it shows up in law, but how, especially when we look at law in action in terms of the implementation and how that is used in a sense in terms of opposition to gains that are made around women's rights, as we see in the South African context, but also beyond as well. The other question, I think, especially around, whether we should bring it out of the dark, right? The whole conversation, especially, I mean, a good example will be the Gambian context, right? Where there's quote unquote never been a publicly, I think we shouldn't perhaps given what's happening, right? But a public engagement around the issue of abortion, even though it's restricted. We have, the Gambia has ratified international human rights norms around these women's rights. Obviously, we have the Women's Act, which is not in compliance technically with international human rights obligations in that sense, but also the need. And I think, I think a couple of years ago, I published this piece about how the Gambia's transition perhaps should be a space to engage in terms of bringing these things to the light, especially in the public sphere, and have a more public engagement. I think part of not publicly engaging in terms of naming things, especially as political, in that sense, I think have brought us to where we are as it relates to the FGM law, but also potentially how that will have a ripple effect. We've already had conversations where the conservative religious movement and those that are pushing for contesting the ban on FGM are now going in for the child marriage law, but also other laws that are related to women's rights. And as I said, especially the contestation around the secular argument, especially during the constitution making process as well. I know Siri is looking at me.
Yeah, no,
I'm
I'm
outside.
looking at
Time, but yes, as I said, I'm happy to engage, especially in terms of the counter narratives that are arising out of these conversations as well. But I also think, for me, I think from what I'm just hearing, especially in terms of feedback and perhaps why this PhD course, but also the master's program, I think is important, especially for emerging scholars, just thinking about methodology, right? Methodology in terms of how do we sort of study these effects and dynamics, especially across region, across countries, I think will be very beneficial as we think around gendered politics of autocratization and things like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Time is horrible. It's just like you try to hold it and it just disappears. But we have more time.
Incredibly smart women.
Yeah.
I feel like I can listen to.
Yes. And the good thing is,
There are more
that-
smart people to come.
Yeah. So we're going to say thank you now, but you're going to listen to each other for quite some time, still today and tomorrow, and hopefully for the long future.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Thank you for putting this together.